The coffee cup shattered against the marble floor like a gunshot in the pristine silence of Meridian Café, sending fragments of bone china skittering across the polished surface in a constellation of destruction. Marcus Blackwell didn't even look down at the mess, his steel-gray eyes fixed with laser intensity on the young waitress who had dared to suggest he might want to reconsider his order during the lunch rush. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Do you have any idea who I am? The words cut through the ambient chatter like a blade, causing conversations to falter and heads to turn throughout the upscale establishment. His voice carried the particular brand of entitlement that came from 20 years of corporate warfare, from climbing over the broken dreams of competitors to reach the 42nd floor corner office that bore his name in gold lettering. Sarah Chen stood perfectly still, her dark eyes reflecting none of the tremor that threatened to betray her composure. The coffee stain spread across her crisp white apron like spilled ink on fresh snow, but she made no move to acknowledge it. Instead, she met his gaze with the kind of quiet dignity that money couldn't buy and power couldn't crush, though Marcus Blackwell was certainly trying his best to prove otherwise. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the flush creeping up her neck. "I was only trying to let you know that the salmon special takes 20 minutes to prepare, and you mentioned being in a hurry for your 1 o'clock meeting." The lunch crowd at Meridian Café had gone nearly silent now, a collection of suits and silk scarves frozen in various stages of their meals, forks suspended halfway to mouths, newspapers forgotten in manicured hands. The establishment prided itself on discretion, on being the kind of place where Seattle's power brokers could conduct business over artisanal bread and locally sourced ingredients. This kind of public spectacle was precisely what their clientele paid premium prices to avoid. Marcus straightened his Italian silk tie with deliberate precision, a gesture that had intimidated countless boardrooms and sent junior executives scrambling for cover. At 52, he had perfected the art of using silence as a weapon, of letting his reputation do the talking while his victims filled the void with increasingly desperate explanations. He was the senior vice president of strategic development at Titan Industries, a company that had devoured smaller firms like a whale consuming krill, and his name appeared regularly in the business sections of newspapers alongside words like ruthless, visionary, and unstoppable. 20 minutes? He let out a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. "Do you see that building across the street? The glass tower with Titan Industries carved into the granite?" He gestured toward the window with a hand that bore a Rolex worth more than most people's cars. "I own the 42nd floor of that building. I have 700 employees who depend on my decisions, and a meeting in 45 minutes that will determine whether a $200 million merger goes through or dies on the conference table." Sarah's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the leather portfolio she carried, a small detail that would have been meaningless to anyone else in the room, but which contained depths of irony that would soon reshape the trajectory of Marcus Blackwell's carefully constructed world. The portfolio was worn smooth from use, its corners softened by countless meetings and presentations, and tucked inside were documents that bore the logo of Pinnacle Dynamics, Titan Industries' most aggressive competitor. "I understand you're busy, sir," she replied, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that spoke of late nights spent perfecting presentations in multiple languages. "Would you prefer the grilled chicken instead? It's ready in 5 minutes." The suggestion hit Marcus like a match to gasoline. In his world, compromise was synonymous with weakness, and weakness was synonymous with failure. He had built his career on the principle that backing down, even in the smallest matters, created cracks in the foundation of authority that would inevitably lead to collapse. The waitress's practical solution wasn't just an affront to his immediate desires. It was a challenge to the very philosophy that had carried him from a middle-class childhood in Spokane to the pinnacle of Seattle's business elite.
"Do I look like someone who settles for chicken?" The question emerged as a growl, low and dangerous. I didn't claw my way to the top of the food chain to have some. He paused, his eyes taking in Sarah's Asian features, her name tag, the slight callus on her ring finger where a wedding band had obviously been removed for work. "Some waitress tell me what I should order for lunch." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, toxic and impossible to take back. Around them, the cafe's patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances, their collective discomfort palpable as they witnessed the kind of behavior that happened behind closed doors being dragged into the merciless light of public scrutiny. A businessman at table 6 folded his newspaper with unnecessary force. A woman in Chanel picked up her phone and began typing furiously, likely alerting her social network to the drama unfolding before her. But it was the man at table 12 who reacted most significantly, though his response was so subtle that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed it at all. David Chen, tall, impeccably dressed, with a kind of quiet confidence that came from building something rather than merely inheriting it, slowly lowered his coffee cup to its saucer. His dark eyes, so similar to Sarah's, followed the interaction with the focused attention of someone conducting a very important experiment. Sarah's response to her husband's presence was equally subtle, a slight straightening of her shoulders, a barely perceptible shift in her stance that suggested she was drawing strength from an invisible source. But to everyone else in the room, including Marcus, she simply looked like a young woman trying to maintain her dignity in the face of spectacular public humiliation. "I'll bring you the salmon, sir," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of resignation that would have satisfied a lesser man. 20 minutes. But Marcus Blackwell was not a lesser man, at least in his own estimation. He was a predator who had smelled blood in the water, and like all predators, he pressed his advantage when he sensed weakness. "And while you're at it," he continued, his voice rising just enough that every person in the vicinity could hear him clearly, "this is America, sweetheart. If you're going to work in customer service, you might want to work on that accent of yours. Makes it hard for real Americans to understand what you're trying to say." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hiss of the espresso machine and the distant sound of traffic filtering through the cafe's floor-to-ceiling windows. It was the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes, heavy with potential energy waiting to be released. Several patrons reached for their phones, not to text, but to record, sensing that they were witnessing something that would soon become much larger than a simple lunch dispute. Sarah's face flushed crimson, but her voice remained steady. "I was born in Bellevue. I've lived here my entire life." Each word was precisely articulated, as if she were reading from a prepared statement. "I'll have your order ready in 20 minutes. She turned to leave, her movements controlled and graceful, despite the obvious strain of the moment. But Marcus wasn't finished. Success in business had taught him that victory wasn't just about winning, it was about making sure your opponent knew they had lost, thoroughly and completely. "Actually," he called after her, loud enough that his voice carried to every corner of the restaurant, "I've changed my mind. I think I'll eat somewhere else, somewhere with better service and staff who understand their place." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. From his wallet, he extracted a $20 bill and dropped it on the table with theatrical disdain. "That's for the coffee you spilled on yourself. Try to be more careful next time." As he strode toward the door, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with the staccato rhythm of a man accustomed to making dramatic exits, Marcus felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from putting someone in their place. It was a feeling he had cultivated over 2 decades of corporate combat, refined through countless negotiations and hostile takeovers. The world was divided into winners and losers, and he had just reminded everyone in Meridian Café which category he belonged to.
But as the door closed behind him with a soft chime, Marcus failed to notice the man at table 12 rising from his seat. Failed to see the way David Chen's jaw tightened as he approached his wife. Failed to observe the small, knowing smile that played at the corners of Sarah's lips as she untied her apron and folded it carefully, placing it on the hostess stand with the finality of someone who would never need to wear it again. The portfolio in Sarah's hands seemed heavier now, weighted with more than just documents and market research. Inside were the architectural plans for Pinnacle Dynamics' new headquarters, financial projections that showed their company poised to overtake Titan Industries within the next 18 months, and, most significantly, a comprehensive analysis of Titan Industries' weaknesses that Sarah had compiled during her 6-month undercover research project. What Marcus Blackwell didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that he had just humiliated the chief strategy officer of his company's most dangerous rival. More than that, he had done it in front of a room full of witnesses, many of whom were already pulling out their phones to share the encounter with their own networks of influence and power. The young waitress he had dismissed so cruelly held 2 master's degrees from Stanford, spoke 4 languages fluently, and had been personally recruited by Pinnacle Dynamics after orchestrating one of the most successful corporate turnarounds in recent West Coast history. She had taken the job at Meridian Café not out of necessity, but as part of an elaborate intelligence-gathering operation designed to understand exactly how Titan Industries executives thought, behaved, and made decisions when they believed no one important was watching. And now, as she walked hand in hand with her husband toward the door, Sarah Chen carried with her something far more valuable than any document or financial report. She had witnessed Marcus Blackwell reveal his true character in the most public way possible. She had seen the man behind the reputation, and more importantly, so had dozens of other people who moved in the same elite circles that Marcus considered his natural habitat. The question that hung in the air as the door closed behind them wasn't whether Marcus Blackwell would regret his behavior. It was whether he would survive the consequences of it. In the rarefied atmosphere of Seattle's business community, reputation was everything. And Marcus had just handed his most dangerous competitor the perfect weapon to destroy his. The game had begun, and Marcus didn't even know he was playing. Marcus Blackwell's corner office on the 42nd floor of the Titan Industries building was a monument to carefully cultivated success. The mahogany desk, imported from a sustainable forest in Honduras, bore the signatures of 3 senators, 2 governors, and a former Secretary of Commerce embedded in its lacquered surface beneath protective glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Elliott Bay, where cargo ships moved like toys across the gray-green water, carrying the dreams and failures of global commerce on their steel decks. But at 3:17 in the afternoon, Marcus found himself staring not at the magnificent view that had cost the company an extra $2 million in lease negotiations, but at his reflection in his computer screen. The monitor had gone dark during his extended contemplation of the lunch incident at Meridian Café, and now it served as an unwelcome mirror, showing him a man whose confidence was beginning to crack around the edges like paint on an old building. The meeting with the Henderson Group had gone poorly.
Not catastrophically. Marcus was too experienced to allow a single incident to derail a $200 million merger. But there had been an unmistakable tension in the conference room that hadn't existed in their previous negotiations. James Henderson himself had seemed distracted, checking his phone more frequently than usual. And when Marcus had suggested they celebrate the preliminary agreement with lunch at Meridian Café, Henderson had politely declined with an excuse about a prior commitment that felt transparently false. "Probably nothing," Marcus muttered to his reflection. But even as he spoke the words, he knew he was trying to convince himself of something he didn't entirely believe. In his experience, successful businessmen didn't worry about the opinions of waitresses or care about the social media chatter of cafe patrons. They focused on results, on bottom lines, on the tangible metrics that separated winners from losers in the unforgiving arena of corporate warfare. So why couldn't he shake the image of the young woman's face when he had suggested she work on her accent? Why did her dignified silence feel more like a victory than his dramatic exit? His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom, interrupting his brooding. "Mr. Blackwell, your wife is on line 3. Marcus straightened automatically, a conditioned response developed over 23 years of marriage to a woman who demanded excellence in all things, including posture during phone conversations she couldn't even see. "Put her through, Janet." The familiar click of connection was followed by Catherine Blackwell's voice, cultured and precise as always, each syllable shaped by the kind of expensive education that taught people how to make others feel inferior without ever raising their voice or saying anything that could be construed as overtly rude. "Marcus, darling, I've just gotten off the phone with Margaret Henderson." Catherine's tone carried the particular brand of disappointment that she had perfected during their marriage, a vocal technique that could make grown men question their life choices without her ever explicitly criticizing anything they had done. "She mentioned that James seemed rather distracted during your meeting today." Marcus felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. "The meeting went fine, Catherine. Henderson's just being cautious, which is smart business sense when dealing with numbers this large." "I'm sure it is, dear." The pause that followed contained volumes of unspoken skepticism. "She also mentioned something about an incident at lunch, something involving you and a service worker at that cafe where you like to conduct your informal meetings." The words hit Marcus like ice water in his veins. If Margaret Henderson knew about the incident at Meridian Café, then it had already begun spreading through the interconnected web of Seattle's social elite. Margaret was notorious for her discretion, which meant that if she was discussing it openly, the story had already reached a level of circulation that made containment impossible. "It was nothing," Marcus said, his voice carrying more defensiveness than he intended. "A waitress was being insolent, and I corrected her behavior. Standard customer service interaction." Catherine's laugh was like crystal breaking in a distant room. "Oh, Marcus, standard customer service interactions don't generate the kind of social media attention that Margaret's daughter Ashley showed her over lunch. Apparently, there are already 3 videos of your correction circulating on various platforms." The bottom dropped out of Marcus's stomach. Videos. In his focus on the business implications of the incident, he had completely forgotten about the ubiquity of smartphones and the modern compulsion to document every moment of public drama for the entertainment of strangers on the internet. "How bad is it?" he asked, already reaching for his laptop to begin damage control. "Well, let's see." Catherine's voice carried the tone of someone reading from prepared notes, which meant that she had already conducted her own research into the situation. "The hashtag #MeridianRacist is currently trending in the Seattle area. The videos have been shared approximately 8,000 times across various platforms, and someone has already created a rather unflattering meme featuring your photograph and some very unkind commentary about your character." Marcus's hands were already flying across his keyboard, pulling up the social media platforms he normally ignored in favor of industry publications and financial reports. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The videos, shot from multiple angles by different patrons, showed him in all his entitled fury, berating a young woman who maintained her dignity even as he systematically attempted to destroy it. But worse than the videos themselves were the comments. Hundreds of them, growing by the minute, each one a small dagger aimed at his professional reputation.
Disgusting behavior from someone who should know better. This is exactly why I'll never support Titan Industries again. Someone should send this to every business partner he has. What an absolute piece of human garbage. But it was the comment from someone identifying themselves as a Titan Industries employee that made Marcus's heart sink completely. I'm ashamed to work for this man. We're not all like this, I promise. Marcus? Catherine's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you still there? I'm here. The words felt thick in his throat, like he was speaking through molasses. Margaret also mentioned that her James has some concerns about associating Titan Industries with the kind of publicity this incident might generate. Nothing definitive, of course, but she thought you should be aware that the Henderson Group values their reputation for social responsibility quite highly. The Henderson Group, the merger, $200 million hanging in the balance, potentially derailed by a moment of pettiness over salmon preparation time and a waitress who had dared to make a practical suggestion. Marcus felt the weight of his own hubris settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. I need to go, Catherine. I have calls to make. Yes, I imagine you do. Oh, and Marcus, you might want to consider making a public apology. The sooner, the better. Margaret says these things have a way of growing rather than shrinking when left unaddressed. The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with his reflection in the dark computer screen and the growing realization that his perfectly controlled world was beginning to spiral beyond his ability to manage it. He had built his career on the principle that strength meant never backing down, never apologizing, never showing weakness to competitors who would inevitably use any sign of vulnerability against him. But for the first time in 20 years, he was beginning to wonder if his greatest strength might also be his most dangerous weakness. His phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter Emma, away at her first year at Columbia. The message contained only a link to one of the videos, followed by a single word, Dad? Marcus stared at the message for a long time before setting his phone aside without responding. How could he explain to his 20-year-old daughter that the man she had looked up to her entire life had just revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person he had always taught her to stand up against? How could he tell her that all his lectures about treating people with dignity and respect had been nothing more than empty words, abandoned the moment his convenience was threatened by a young woman who was probably someone else's daughter trying to do her job with grace under pressure? Outside his window, the sun was beginning to set over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Marcus saw none of it. He was too busy calculating the potential cost of his moment of weakness, tallying up the relationships and business deals that might be damaged by the revelation of his true character. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he sat alone in his expensive office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, was that across the city, in the sleek conference room of Pinnacle Dynamics, Sarah Chen was presenting those same videos to her executive team with the clinical precision of a surgeon explaining a particularly interesting case. As you can see, her voice steady and professional despite the personal nature of the attack she had endured, Mr. Blackwell's reaction under pressure reveals several key insights into Titan Industries' corporate culture and decision-making processes.
When challenged, even minimally, he immediately resorts to personal attacks and displays of dominance rather than attempting to find collaborative solutions. The room was silent, except for the soft whir of the air conditioning and the distant hum of Seattle traffic. David Chen watched from his position at the head of the conference table, his expression neutral despite the anger that burned in his dark eyes. As CEO of Pinnacle Dynamics, he had learned to separate his personal feelings from business decisions, but watching his wife present evidence of her own humiliation with such professional detachment required every ounce of self-control he possessed.
This kind of behavior pattern, Sarah continued, advancing to the next slide in her presentation, suggests that Titan Industries may be vulnerable to public relations pressure in a way that their financial statements don't reveal. Companies with executives who lack emotional regulation under stress tend to make increasingly poor decisions when faced with sustained pressure. One of the junior executives raised her hand tentatively. Are we seriously considering using a personal attack on Sarah as part of our competitive strategy? David spoke for the first time since the presentation began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built Pinnacle Dynamics from a startup in his garage to the fastest-growing tech company in the Pacific Northwest. We're not creating content or manufacturing situations. We're simply making sure that Mr. Blackwell's own behavior receives the attention it deserves. There's a difference between exploitation and accountability. Sarah clicked to the final slide, which showed a comprehensive timeline of social media engagement, traditional media pickup, and preliminary corporate response from Titan Industries' public relations department. The question isn't whether we should use this information, she said, meeting each person's eyes around the table. The question is whether we can afford not to. Titan Industries has built their reputation on the idea that they're the more established, more respectable choice in our market. If that reputation is compromised, it creates opportunities for companies that can demonstrate actual respect for their employees and customers. As the meeting concluded and the executives filed out of the conference room, discussing implementation strategies and media outreach in the subdued tones of people who understood the gravity of what they were planning, Sarah remained behind with her husband. The videos were still playing on the large screen at the front of the room, showing Marcus Blackwell's face twisted with contempt as he berated a young woman who was, unbeknownst to him, about to become the architect of his professional downfall. "Are you okay with this?" David asked quietly, his hand finding hers across the polished surface of the conference table. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching her own image on the screen. The way she had maintained her composure, even as Marcus systematically tried to strip away her dignity. The small tremor in her hands that only someone who loved her would notice. The barely perceptible straightening of her shoulders when she had drawn strength from knowing her husband was watching. "He made a choice," she said, finally. "He chose to reveal who he really is when he thought there would be no consequences. All we're doing is making sure the consequences he assumed wouldn't exist actually exist." The first sign that Marcus Blackwell's world was shifting beneath his feet came at 7:30 the following morning, when his usual table at Meridian Café was inexplicably unavailable despite his standing reservation. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes and an apologetic smile, explained that there had been a scheduling mix-up and offered him a table near the kitchen instead, which in the subtle geography of power dining was equivalent to being seated in Siberia. "I'll wait," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the expectation of immediate accommodation that had served him well for 2 decades. But as he stood in the entryway of the cafe, watching other patrons glance in his direction before quickly looking away, he began to understand that his reputation had preceded him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The hostess consulted her reservation system with the kind of elaborate theater that barely concealed her discomfort. "I'm afraid it might be quite a while, Mr. Blackwell. Perhaps you might prefer—" "I said I'll wait." The words came out sharper than he intended, causing several nearby diners to pause their conversations and turn toward the commotion. Marcus immediately recognized his mistake. He was creating exactly the kind of scene that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. But backing down now would signal weakness to an audience that was clearly already predisposed to think poorly of him. 15 minutes later, still standing in the entryway like a supplicant seeking an audience with royalty, Marcus caught sight of James Henderson entering the cafe with Margaret at his side.
Henderson's eyes met his for a brief moment before sliding away with the kind of deliberate avoidance that spoke volumes about the current state of their business relationship. "Jim," Marcus called out, crossing the cafe with the determined stride of a man refusing to acknowledge that he was currently persona non grata. "Perfect timing. I wanted to follow up on our discussion yesterday about the timeline for the merger documentation." James Henderson was a man who had built his fortune on reading people and situations with surgical precision. At 62, he had survived 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and 1 particularly messy divorce by understanding when to advance and when to retreat. The expression on his face as Marcus approached was the look of someone who had already made his tactical assessment and found it wanting. "Marcus," Henderson said, his voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that was somehow more devastating than outright hostility. "Margaret and I were just discussing the importance of corporate values alignment in major business partnerships. Amazing how much a company's character matters to long-term success, isn't it?" The words hit Marcus like a precision-guided missile, each syllable carefully chosen to deliver maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability. Henderson was withdrawing from the merger, not explicitly, not in a way that would create legal complications, but with the kind of diplomatic language that made his intentions crystal clear to anyone with experience in high-stakes business negotiations. "Values alignment," Marcus repeated, his mind racing to find a response that would salvage the situation without acknowledging the underlying crisis. "Absolutely. That's always been a cornerstone of Titan Industries' approach to partnerships." Margaret Henderson chose that moment to speak, her voice carrying the particular brand of social authority that came from chairing charity boards and hosting political fundraisers. "Oh yes, I saw some fascinating examples of Titan Industries' values just yesterday. Margaret Peterson forwarded me the most interesting videos from this very cafe. Such an authentic glimpse into corporate culture, don't you think?" The conversation was taking place in full view of the cafe's other patrons, many of whom were now openly listening to the exchange with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for watching car accidents in slow motion. Marcus could feel his carefully constructed reputation crumbling in real time, each word of the conversation adding another crack to the foundation of his professional credibility. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding about that incident," Marcus began, but Henderson raised his hand to stop him. "No misunderstanding at all, Marcus. Sometimes the most revealing moments are the ones where people think no one important is watching." Henderson's smile was razor-sharp. "Margaret and I have decided that the Henderson Group needs to partner with companies that share our commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or background." The rejection was delivered with such elegant brutality that Marcus almost admired its craftsmanship. Henderson had just terminated a $200 million deal without ever explicitly saying the words, had destroyed a relationship that had taken 3 years to build, and had done it all while maintaining the appearance of reasonable business prudence. It was a masterclass in corporate assassination, and Marcus found himself on the receiving end with no viable defense. As the Hendersons excused themselves and were immediately seated at what had previously been Marcus's regular table, he finally understood the true scope of his predicament. This wasn't just about social media embarrassment or temporary public relations damage. He had crossed a line that he hadn't even realized existed, and the consequences were rippling outward through his professional network with devastating efficiency. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Country Club board meeting moved to emergency session. Margaret Peterson wants to discuss recent incidents affecting reputation. You need to be there in 1 hour." The Pine Ridge Country Club had been Marcus's sanctuary for 8 years, the place where Seattle's business elite gathered to make the real decisions that shaped the city's economic landscape. The golf course was where more deals were closed than in all the conference rooms in downtown Seattle combined. And the monthly board meetings were exercises in maintaining the delicate social ecosystem that kept the powerful connected to each other and insulated from the concerns of ordinary citizens. But as Marcus walked into the club's mahogany-paneled boardroom, he immediately sensed that the atmosphere had changed. The usual warm greetings and casual banter were replaced by polite nods and carefully neutral expressions. Margaret Peterson, the club president and unofficial queen of Seattle's social hierarchy, sat at the head of the long table with the bearing of someone preparing to deliver an unpleasant but necessary verdict. "Marcus," she said as he took his usual seat, "thank you for coming on such short notice. I know you're busy with your various business endeavors." The phrasing was ominous. Margaret never referred to his work as various business endeavors. She typically spoke of Titan Industries with the kind of respect reserved for institutions that provided substantial donations to her favorite charities and sponsored tables at her fundraising galas. "Of course, Margaret. Always happy to support the club in whatever way I can." Margaret opened a leather portfolio and removed what appeared to be a printed compilation of social media screenshots, news articles, and what looked like complaint letters from club members. "We've received some concerning communications over the past 24 hours regarding behavior that may reflect poorly on the club's reputation and values." She slid the documents across the table toward Marcus, and as he reviewed them, the full scope of his crisis began to crystallize. The videos from Meridian Café had been shared not just on general social media platforms, but within the closed Facebook groups and private messaging chains that connected Seattle's elite community. Worse, someone had taken the trouble to research his club membership and had begun a coordinated campaign to pressure Pine Ridge into taking action. "These are private communications taken out of context," Marcus said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they sounded like the desperate deflection of someone caught in an indefensible position. "Context," repeated board member William Ashford, a retired federal judge whose opinions carried considerable weight in the room. "I've reviewed the materials extensively, Marcus, and I'm having difficulty understanding what context would make this behavior acceptable for someone representing our club in the community." Around the table, Marcus could see the faces of men and women he had considered friends, colleagues, and allies for nearly a decade. But their expressions now reflected the cold calculation of people protecting their own interests from association with a potentially toxic asset. He was witnessing his own social execution, carried out with the same ruthless efficiency that he had once admired when applied to others. Margaret Peterson cleared her throat with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "The board has discussed this matter at length, and we've decided that a temporary suspension of your membership privileges would be appropriate while we conduct a formal review of the situation." "Temporary suspension?" Marcus felt the words catch in his throat. "Margaret, you've known me for 8 years. You know this doesn't represent who I am or what I believe." "Do I?" Margaret's response was delivered with surgical precision. "Because the evidence suggests that this is exactly who you are when you think no one who matters is watching. And that, frankly, is the most revealing character assessment of all." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but Marcus barely heard the procedural discussions about review timelines and appeal processes. His attention was fixed on the realization that his social isolation was being systematically engineered by people who understood exactly how to apply pressure where it would cause maximum damage. The country club wasn't just a recreational facility. It was the central nervous system of his professional network, and losing access meant losing the informal relationships that made formal business possible. As he walked to his car in the club's parking lot, Marcus's phone rang with a call from his assistant. "Mr. Blackwell, I've been trying to reach you. We've had 3 major clients request meetings to discuss their ongoing relationships with Titan Industries, and the communications department is fielding media inquiries about your role in the company's diversity and inclusion initiatives." What kind of media inquiries? Well, apparently someone leaked information about the Henderson Group merger falling through, and now reporters are asking whether there's a connection between that and the incident at the cafe. Also, there's been a significant increase in negative reviews for the company on various business rating websites. Marcus closed his eyes and leaned against his car, feeling the weight of consequences he hadn't anticipated when he decided to put a waitress in her place. What had seemed like a moment of justifiable authority was revealing itself to be the first domino in a chain reaction that threatened to destroy everything he had built. But the most devastating blow came that evening, delivered not through business channels or social media, but in the quiet sanctuary of his own home. Emma had returned from Colombia for an unexpected visit, ostensibly for a long weekend, but clearly motivated by concerns about her father's increasingly public disgrace. "Dad," she said as they sat in his study, surrounded by the awards and photographs that documented his rise to prominence, "I need to understand what happened at that restaurant." Marcus looked at his daughter, brilliant, compassionate, idealistic in the way that only 20-year-olds could be, and realized that his explanation would define not just their relationship going forward, but his own understanding of who he had become over the course of his successful career. "It was a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion," he began, but Emma's expression stopped him cold. "I watched the videos, Dad, all of them, from multiple angles." Her voice carried a disappointment that cut deeper than any business rejection or social media criticism. "That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was you being cruel to someone who was trying to help you." The conversation that followed would later be remembered by Marcus as the moment when he truly understood the cost of his behavior. Emma spoke with the moral clarity of someone who had been raised with privilege, but had chosen to use it as a platform for supporting others rather than a weapon for maintaining superiority. She talked about the work she was doing with immigrant rights organizations at Columbia, about the friends she had made from backgrounds similar to the waitress he had humiliated, about the values she thought she had learned from her father before discovering that they were apparently negotiable depending on circumstances and audience. "The worst part," Emma said, as their conversation wound toward its inevitable conclusion, "is that I used to tell people about how proud I was of you, how you had taught me to treat everyone with respect and kindness. And now I have to figure out whether that was ever really true, or whether you just saved the good behavior for people who could do something for you." As his daughter returned to her dorm room the next morning, carrying with her a new and unwelcome understanding of her father's character, Marcus began to comprehend that his crisis was only beginning to unfold. The Henderson Group merger was gone. His country club membership was suspended. His professional reputation was under siege from multiple directions. But the loss that cut deepest was the one reflected in his daughter's eyes, the recognition that the man she had admired her entire life might not be worthy of that admiration after all. What Marcus still didn't know as he stood at his study window watching Emma's taxi disappear into Seattle traffic was that his public humiliation had provided his competitors with something far more valuable than any business intelligence or financial data. It had given them a comprehensive psychological profile of how he responded to pressure, stress, and unexpected challenges. And in the sleek offices of Pinnacle Dynamics, that information was being weaponized with the precision of a military operation.
Sarah Chen stood before a wall-mounted display that showed real-time social media analytics, news mentions, and business intelligence data streaming in from dozens of sources. The numbers told a story of systematic reputation destruction that was proceeding ahead of schedule and exceeding all projected outcomes. Hashtags related to Marcus and Titan Industries were trending across multiple platforms. Traditional media outlets were picking up the story with increasing frequency, and most importantly, business partners were beginning to distance themselves publicly from association with the company. Phase 1 exceeded expectations, reported Jennifer Martinez, Pinnacle Dynamics' Director of Strategic Communications,
as she updated the executive team on their progress. The organic social media amplification has reached approximately 2.3 million impressions across all platforms. Traditional media pickup includes coverage in the Seattle Times business section, Forbes Online, and 3 industry trade publications. Most significantly, we've identified 12 major business relationships that are currently under review as a direct result of the incident. David Chen listened to the report with the focused attention of a chess master calculating moves 10 turns ahead. As CEO, he understood that bringing down a competitor required more than just exploiting a single moment of weakness. It demanded a comprehensive strategy that systematically dismantled every pillar supporting their opponent's position in the market. "What about the secondary targets?" he asked, referring to the broader ecosystem of relationships and partnerships that kept Titan Industries competitive. The Pine Ridge Country Club suspension was more effective than we anticipated. Club members are apparently sharing the story within their own business networks, creating a ripple effect that's reaching decision-makers who weren't even on our original target list. Sarah moved away from the analytics display and took her position at the conference table, her expression thoughtful as she processed the implications of their success. "We need to be careful about overreach," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who understood that victories could become defeats if pushed too far. The goal isn't to destroy Marcus Blackwell personally. It's to demonstrate that Pinnacle Dynamics represents a better choice for businesses that care about corporate responsibility and ethical leadership. She clicked a remote control and the wall display shifted to show a comprehensive timeline of planned initiatives designed to capitalize on the momentum they had generated. Phase 2 focuses on positive positioning rather than negative campaigning. We announce our new diversity and inclusion initiatives, showcase our employee satisfaction ratings, and launch the community outreach programs we've been developing. The strategy was elegant in its sophistication. Use Marcus's public failure as a launching pad for Pinnacle Dynamics' own brand positioning, creating a stark contrast between the two companies' approaches to leadership and corporate citizenship. Rather than simply tearing down their competitor, they were building themselves up as the obvious alternative for customers and partners who had been alienated by Titan Industries' toxic culture. "The Fenderson Group has already reached out through back channels," David reported, unable to suppress a small smile of satisfaction. "They're interested in discussions about the kind of partnership they were originally considering with Titan. Apparently, they're very impressed with our corporate values and leadership approach." Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus was discovering that professional crisis had a way of accelerating beyond any individual's ability to control or contain it. His morning had begun with a conference call from Titan Industries' board of directors, a meeting that was presented as a routine check-in, but felt suspiciously like an intervention. "Marcus," said board chairman Robert Fitzgerald, his voice carrying the weight of fiduciary responsibility and mounting shareholder concern, "we need to discuss the company's public relations situation and how it's affecting our business relationships." The call took place in Marcus's office, but he felt like a defendant in his own trial as the board members expressed their concerns about client retention, media coverage, and what Fitzgerald diplomatically referred to as leadership optics in the current business environment.
"This is a temporary setback," Marcus insisted, his voice carrying more confidence than he actually felt. "Social media controversies have short attention spans. Give it 2 weeks and everyone will have moved on to the next scandal." "Perhaps," replied board member Catherine Walsh, whose venture capital background had taught her to identify systemic risks before they became existential threats. "But we're not just dealing with social media attention anymore. We're seeing measurable business impact. The Henderson merger was worth $200 million. 3 other major clients have requested meetings to review their ongoing relationships with us. Our stock prices dropped 6% in 2 days." Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that had served as his primary response to challenges throughout his career. But for the first time, he recognized it as a liability rather than an asset. His instinct was to push back, to assert his authority, and demand loyalty from board members who owed their positions to his successful leadership. But the incident at Meridian Café had taught him that his usual tactics might no longer be reliable tools for maintaining control. "What are you suggesting?"
he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We're suggesting that you consider taking a temporary leave of absence while we conduct a comprehensive review of the situation. Let the communications department handle the public relations aspects while you focus on personal reflection." The phrase personal reflection was corporate euphemism for exile, a polite way of saying that his presence was now considered a liability to the company he had spent 2 decades building into a regional powerhouse. Marcus understood that accepting a leave of absence would be interpreted as an admission of guilt, but refusing might trigger a board revolt that could end his career entirely. "I need time to consider your recommendation," he said finally, choosing his words carefully to avoid commitments he might later regret. The call ended with polite exchanges and promises to reconvene within 48 hours. But Marcus knew that his time as the undisputed leader of Titan Industries was already over. The only question was whether his departure would be voluntary or involuntary, graceful or devastating. That afternoon brought a development that Marcus hadn't anticipated, but that would prove to be the decisive factor in his downfall. Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociology professor at the University of Washington and a nationally recognized expert on workplace discrimination, published an op-ed in the Seattle Times that elevated the Meridian Café incident from local gossip to national conversation. "The Marcus Blackwell incident represents far more than one executive's bad day," Dr. Williams wrote, with academic precision and moral clarity. "It provides a window into the systemic attitudes that perpetuate inequality in American corporate culture. When successful businessmen feel entitled to publicly humiliate service workers, particularly women and people of color, they reveal belief systems that inevitably influence hiring decisions, promotion opportunities, and workplace environments for thousands of employees." The op-ed was shared thousands of times within hours of publication, picked up by national business publications, and cited in discussions on cable news programs. But more significantly, it provided language and context for business leaders who had been struggling to articulate why the incident felt so significant. Dr. Williams had transformed Marcus's moment of cruelty from an embarrassing personal failing into a case study of corporate leadership accountability. The impact was immediate and devastating. Titan Industries' communications department was flooded with interview requests from national media outlets. 2 major clients formally terminated their contracts, citing incompatible values as the reason for their decisions. Most damaging of all, 3 senior executives tendered their resignations, publicly stating that they could no longer represent a company whose leadership demonstrated such disregard for basic human dignity.
As Marcus read Dr. Williams's op-ed for the 3rd time that evening, sitting alone in his home office with a glass of whiskey that had gone untouched for over an hour, he began to understand that he was facing something more complex than a public relations crisis. He was confronting the consequences of a worldview that had served him well during his climb to success, but had ultimately revealed itself to be fundamentally toxic. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma Glunn. "Dad, I saw the news coverage today. If you want to talk about how to make this right, I'm here for you. But you need to actually want to make it right, not just make it go away." The distinction his daughter had drawn between making things right and making them go away crystallized something that Marcus had been avoiding since the moment he walked out of Meridian Café. His every instinct had been focused on damage control, reputation management, and strategic positioning to minimize the consequences of his behavior. But he had spent almost no time considering whether he owed anyone an apology, whether his actions had caused genuine harm, or whether the young waitress he had humiliated deserved better from him regardless of the business implications. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Blackwell was forced to confront the possibility that being successful didn't necessarily mean being right.
and that the power he had accumulated over 2 decades might have corrupted his judgment in ways he was only beginning to understand. The game had moved into a new phase, but Marcus was still playing by the old rules. And across the city, his opponents were about to demonstrate just how dangerous that miscalculation could be. The revelation came not with the dramatic flair of a movie plot twist, but with the quiet devastation of a medical diagnosis delivered in a sterile conference room. Marcus Blackwell sat across from his own attorney, flanked by 2 senior partners from Seattle's most prestigious crisis management firm, as they explained the results of their preliminary investigation into his competitor's activities. The waitress you encountered at Meridian Café is Dr. Sarah Chen, Chief Strategy Officer of Pinnacle Dynamics. She holds master's degrees in both business administration and international relations from Stanford University, speaks 4 languages fluently, and orchestrated 3 major corporate turnarounds over the past 8 years. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each fact a hammer strike against the edifice of assumptions he had constructed around the incident. The young woman he had dismissed as an insolent service worker was in fact one of the most accomplished business strategists on the West Coast, and more significantly, a key executive at his primary competitor. She was conducting intelligence gathering, continued crisis management specialist David Porter, consulting notes that had been compiled by a private investigation firm at considerable expense. Our research indicates that she had been working at Meridian Café for approximately 6 months, specifically targeting the restaurant's high-profile business clientele for competitive research purposes. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications crystallized. "You're telling me that she was there specifically to spy on me?" "Not specifically on you," Hawthorne clarified, "but on Titan Industries executives and their business practices more generally. The cafe was chosen as a research location because it's known as an informal meeting place for Seattle's business community. Dr. Chen was essentially conducting field research on corporate behavior when executives believe they're operating in private settings." The methodical destruction of Marcus's worldview continued as Porter presented additional findings that painted a picture of sophisticated strategic planning that made Marcus's own business acumen look amateurish by comparison. Pinnacle Dynamics hadn't simply taken advantage of the situation at Meridian Café,
Advantage of his public humiliation. They had created conditions that made such an incident statistically likely, then positioned themselves to capitalize on whatever emerged. The husband, Porter continued, is David Chen, CEO and founder of Pinnacle Dynamics. According to our sources, he was present in the restaurant during your interaction with his wife, though he remained concealed at a table across the room. Multiple witnesses confirmed that he observed the entire incident but chose not to intervene or reveal his identity. Marcus closed his eyes as he absorbed this information, recognizing that what he had interpreted as a moment of justifiable authority assertion had actually been a carefully orchestrated test of his character, one that he had failed spectacularly in front of his primary business rival. The young woman's composure during his verbal assault now took on a different meaning. She had maintained her dignity not just as a matter of personal integrity, but as a strategic professional who understood that her reaction was being evaluated by the person who mattered most. "How long have they been planning this?" he asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to know the answer. Hawthorne exchanged glances with Porter before responding. "Our investigation suggests that Pinnacle Dynamics began developing this competitive intelligence strategy approximately 18 months ago, shortly after they identified Titan Industries as their primary market rival. The specific cafe operation was initiated 6 months ago, suggesting a significant long-term investment in understanding your company's executive behavior patterns. The sophistication of the operation was both impressive and terrifying. While Marcus had been focused on traditional competitive metrics, market share, client acquisition, technological innovation, his rivals had been conducting an anthropological study of his company's leadership culture. They had identified weaknesses he didn't even know existed and had created conditions designed to reveal them at the most damaging possible moment.
But here's where it gets more complex, Porter continued, his expression grim. The social media amplification campaign that followed the incident shows signs of professional coordination. Hashtag usage patterns, timing of posts, and geographic distribution of shares suggest that Pinnacle Dynamics has been orchestrating the public relations aspect of your downfall with the same precision they applied to gathering the initial intelligence. Marcus felt the flash of his old anger at being outmaneuvered so comprehensively, but it was quickly replaced by something more unsettling: recognition that his opponents had played the game at a level he didn't understand even existed. While Marcus had been operating according to traditional business warfare principles, attacking market share, competing on price and service quality, engaging in straightforward corporate rivalry, they had been waging psychological warfare designed to expose and exploit character weaknesses. "What are our legal options?" he asked, grasping for some form of recourse that might restore his sense of control over the situation. Hawthorne's expression provided the answer before she spoke. Minimal. Dr. Chen was employed legitimately by the restaurant. Her intelligence-gathering activities, while ethically questionable, don't appear to violate any specific laws related to corporate espionage or unfair business practices. The social media campaign, while professionally coordinated, consists primarily of authentic reactions to genuine behavior that was documented by multiple independent sources. The legal assessment was devastating in its clarity. Marcus had been destroyed by his own actions, captured and amplified by his opponents, but not fabricated or manipulated. Every consequence he was experiencing flowed directly from choices he had made, words he had spoken, and attitudes he had revealed when he believed there would be no meaningful accountability. The most damaging aspect, Porter added, is that they've positioned themselves as the ethical alternative to your leadership style. While your reputation has been systematically dismantled, Pinnacle Dynamics has simultaneously launched a corporate responsibility campaign that highlights their commitment to diversity, inclusion, and respectful workplace culture. They're not just destroying your brand, they're absorbing your market position. As the meeting concluded and Marcus found himself alone in the conference room, surrounded by legal documents and crisis management reports that documented his professional downfall in clinical detail, he began to understand that he was facing an opponent who had outthought, outplanned, and out-executed him at every level. Sarah Chen hadn't simply been in the right place at the right time to document his moment of weakness. She had created the conditions for that weakness to emerge, then systematically exploited every consequence with the precision of a master strategist.
His phone buzzed with a call from Robert Fitzgerald, the board chairman whose voice now carried the weight of irreversible decision-making. "Marcus, the board has reached a consensus. Given the ongoing business impact and the recent revelations about competitive intelligence gathering, we believe it's in everyone's best interest for you to step down as senior vice president, effective immediately." The words felt surreal, like dialogue from someone else's life. Marcus had built Titan Industries' strategic development division from nothing into a regional powerhouse, had negotiated deals with billions of dollars, had made the company a fixture in Seattle's business community. But none of that mattered now, because a moment of casual cruelty had provided his opponents with the perfect weapon to destroy everything he had built. "The severance package is generous," Fitzgerald continued, "and will provide positive references for any future opportunities that don't compete directly with our core business interests. But we need your resignation letter by close of business today, and we'll be announcing the leadership transition tomorrow morning." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that his career crisis had crossed the line from professional setback to personal reckoning. The business consequences, lost deals, damaged relationships, terminated employment, were severe but ultimately manageable for someone with his experience and connections. But the revelation that his downfall had been orchestrated by people who understood his character better than he understood himself forced him to confront questions that couldn't be resolved through strategic planning or competitive analysis. The young woman at Meridian Café hadn't deserved his contempt, regardless of her professional qualifications or intelligence-gathering agenda.
The cruelty he had displayed towards someone he perceived as powerless revealed something about his character that was independent of any business context or competitive pressure. Sarah Chen's elaborate operation had succeeded not because she had manipulated him into behaving badly, but because she had created conditions where his true nature would be revealed. That evening, as Marcus sat in his home office, composing his resignation letter from the company he had devoted his adult life to building, he found himself thinking not about strategic revenge or reputation rehabilitation, but about the expression on Sarah Chen's face as he had systematically tried to humiliate her in front of a restaurant full of witnesses. She had maintained her composure and dignity even while being attacked by someone who held what he assumed was absolute power over her immediate circumstances. She had shown grace under pressure, while he had revealed himself to be capable of casual cruelty. The letter he wrote that night was not the strategic document he had initially planned, full of face-saving language and implied criticism of the board's decision. Instead, it was a simple acknowledgement of responsibility for the consequences of his own behavior, an acceptance of the damage he had caused to the company's reputation, and an expression of regret for actions that had revealed aspects of his character he was only beginning to understand. But even as he composed his resignation, Marcus knew that his crisis was far from over. Losing his job was painful, but losing his understanding of himself as fundamentally decent person was devastating in ways that no crisis management firm could address. The revelation that his downfall had been orchestrated by people who understood his character better than he understood himself was less troubling than the recognition that they had succeeded because the flaws they exploited were genuine aspects of his character.
Chen, written in precise handwriting on expensive stationery that suggested both formality and personal significance. Dr. Chen, the letter began, I am writing to acknowledge that my behavior at Meridian Café was inexcusable regardless of any business or professional context. You conducted yourself with dignity and professionalism, while I revealed aspects of my character that I am only beginning to understand and deeply regret. My actions were not justified by stress, competition, or any other circumstance. They reflected attitudes and assumptions that I now recognize as fundamentally wrong and harmful. I owe you an apology that extends far beyond business considerations or public relations management. You deserve to be treated with basic human respect, and my failure to provide that respect was a moral failing that has forced me to examine beliefs and behaviors I had previously taken for granted. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your grace under pressure taught me more about leadership and character than 20 years of business success ever did. Respectfully, Marcus Blackwell. Sarah read the letter twice before sharing it with her husband, her expression thoughtful as she processed the implications of what appeared to be genuine contrition from someone who had every reason to be focused on strategic reputation management rather than moral reflection. What do you think? David asked, studying his wife's face for clues about her emotional response to what was clearly an unexpected development in their carefully orchestrated campaign. I think, Sarah said slowly, that this is more complicated than we planned for. 6 months after Marcus Blackwell's resignation from Titan Industries, Seattle's business community had largely moved on to newer scandals and fresher controversies. The Meridian Café incident had become a case study taught in business schools, a cautionary tale about the intersection of character and leadership that professors used to illustrate the importance of ethical behavior in an age of social media accountability. But for the individuals whose lives had been fundamentally altered by those few minutes of recorded cruelty and its aftermath, the process of healing and reconstruction was far more complex than academic analysis could capture. Marcus stood at the podium of the Community Center for Economic Justice, a nonprofit organization that provided career training and business development services to low-income residents throughout King County. The audience consisted of 43 aspiring entrepreneurs,
recent immigrants, and individuals seeking to rebuild their lives after various forms of personal and professional setback. It was not the kind of venue where Marcus Blackwell would have been found during his tenure as a senior executive at Titan Industries. But then, the person speaking today was not quite the same man who had walked out of Meridian Café 6 months earlier. "My name is Marcus Blackwell," he began, his voice carrying a humility that his former colleagues would have found almost unrecognizable. "Most of you probably don't know who I am, but some of you may have seen videos of me behaving very badly toward a young woman who was trying to do her job with dignity and professionalism." The admission drew some surprised murmurs from the audience. Marcus had learned that acknowledging his failures directly, without euphemism or deflection, was more powerful than any attempt at reputation management. In the months following his resignation, he had discovered that taking responsibility for his actions, genuinely taking responsibility, not just managing the consequences, was both more difficult and more liberating than any strategic response he might have crafted. "I'm here today because that experience taught me something important about success and character that I want to share with you. For 20 years, I thought that being successful meant being powerful enough to treat people however I chose, particularly people I perceived as having less power than I did. I was wrong about success, I was wrong about power, and I was wrong about what kind of person I wanted to be." The speech he gave that morning was the 15th he had delivered over the past 4 months as part of a speaking program he had developed in partnership with community organizations throughout the Pacific Northwest. The program wasn't court-ordered community service or strategic reputation management. It was Marcus's attempt to transform his public failure into something that might benefit people who were facing their own challenges with dignity and perseverance. "The young woman I treated so poorly that day conducted herself with more grace and professionalism under pressure than I had shown during 20 years of corporate leadership," he told the audience. "She taught me that real strength isn't about having the power to hurt people. It's about having the power to help them and choosing to use it wisely." After his presentation, Marcus spent 2 hours meeting individually with audience members who sought advice about starting businesses, navigating workplace discrimination, or recovering from professional setbacks. These conversations had become the most meaningful part of his new routine, reminders that leadership could be about lifting people up rather than maintaining dominance over them. One conversation particularly stayed with him. A young woman named Maria Santos, who had immigrated from El Salvador 5 years earlier and was working 3 jobs while pursuing a degree in business administration. Her questions about entrepreneurship were thoughtful and well-researched, but Marcus could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the determination that kept her moving forward despite obstacles that would have discouraged someone with fewer resources and less resilience. "Mr. Blackwell," she said as their conversation concluded, "I watched those videos when they first came out, and I was angry at how you treated that waitress. But I'm grateful that you're here today, talking to us about what you learned. It gives me hope that people can change, and that success doesn't have to make someone cruel." Her words stayed with Marcus as he drove back to his downtown apartment, a modest space he had chosen after selling the Bellevue mansion that had served as a monument to his corporate success. The downsizing had been practical, his severance package was generous but not unlimited, but it had also been symbolic of his attempt to rebuild his life around different priorities and values. Meanwhile, across the city, Sarah Chen was experiencing her own form of complicated aftermath. The strategic campaign that had brought down Marcus Blackwell had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. Pinnacle Dynamics had absorbed 3 major clients from Titan Industries, completed the Henderson Group merger that Marcus had lost, and established itself as the premier choice for businesses seeking partners with demonstrated commitments to ethical leadership and corporate responsibility. But success had brought unexpected moral complexity. The handwritten apology letter from Marcus had been followed by others, not seeking forgiveness or business opportunities, but simply acknowledging the harm he had caused and the lessons he claimed to be learning from the experience. Sarah found herself following his post-resignation activities through news coverage and social media, watching someone who had been her strategic target transform into something approaching a genuine advocate for the kind of respectful workplace culture she had been trying to promote. "I think we may have created a monster," David said one evening as they reviewed quarterly performance reports that showed Pinnacle Dynamics' continued growth and market expansion. "But not the kind of monster we were expecting." Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she had been reading an article about Marcus's work with community organizations and his emerging reputation as someone who had learned difficult lessons about leadership and character through public humiliation. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we set out to destroy someone who represented everything wrong with corporate culture, and we may have accidentally created someone who represents what we want corporate culture to become." David's expression was thoughtful as he processed the unintended consequences of their strategic victory. "He's become more effective at promoting our values than we are." The observation was both accurate and unsettling. Marcus's speaking engagements and community involvement had generated more positive media coverage for the concepts of ethical leadership and workplace respect than any public relations campaign Pinnacle Dynamics had ever mounted. His transformation from cautionary tale to advocate had
Created a narrative of redemption and personal growth that resonated with audiences in ways that traditional corporate messaging could not match. "Are you saying we should regret what we did?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. "I'm saying that we accomplished something we didn't intend, and now we have to figure out what that means for how we move forward." David's response reflected the kind of strategic thinking that had built Pinnacle Dynamics into a major player in Seattle's tech scene. "We've created a situation where our former enemy has become an unexpected ally in promoting the values we care about. That's not necessarily bad, but it's definitely not what we planned." The conversation was interrupted by a call from Jennifer Martinez, their Director of Strategic Communications, with news that would complicate their assessment even further. "We've received a request from the Washington State Business Council for someone from Pinnacle Dynamics to participate in a panel discussion about corporate responsibility and ethical leadership. The interesting part is that they want us to appear alongside Marcus Blackwell as an example of how business conflicts can be resolved constructively." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she absorbed the implications. The Business Council was one of the most influential organizations in the state, and panel discussions at their quarterly meetings were attended by hundreds of executives, politicians, and community leaders. Being invited to participate was a significant honor that could further establish Pinnacle Dynamics' reputation as a thought leader in corporate ethics. But sharing a stage with Marcus Blackwell would require her to confront the personal aspects of their conflict in a very public forum. "What's the theme of the panel?" David asked, though Sarah suspected he already knew the answer would be problematic. "From conflict to collaboration, how business leaders can learn from failure and build better corporate cultures. They want to use your situation as a case study in how public accountability can drive positive change when handled constructively by all parties involved." The request forced Sarah and David to grapple with questions they had been avoiding since Marcus's first apology letter arrived. Their strategic campaign had succeeded in every measurable way. They had damaged a competitor, absorbed market share, and established their brand as the ethical alternative in their industry. But the human consequences of their success were proving more complex than they had anticipated when the operation was purely theoretical. "We need to decide whether we're comfortable being associated with Marcus's redemption narrative," Sarah said finally. "If we participate in this panel, we're essentially validating his claim to have learned and grown from the experience. We're helping him rehabilitate his reputation." David nodded slowly. "And if we decline, we risk looking petty or vindictive, especially since he's been consistently gracious in his public comments about us." The decision they ultimately reached reflected the pragmatic idealism that had always characterized their approach to business and competition. They would participate in the panel, but on terms that maintained their dignity and integrity while acknowledging the complex human dimensions of their conflict with Marcus. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself backstage at the Washington State Convention Center,
preparing for what would be the most emotionally challenging presentation of her career. Through the curtains, she could see an audience of nearly 600 business leaders, politicians, and community advocates who had come to witness what the event organizers were billing as a groundbreaking discussion of corporate accountability and ethical leadership. Marcus arrived 15 minutes before our scheduled appearance, looking nervous but determined as he reviewed his notes one final time. He had lost weight since their encounter at Meridian Café, and his expensive suits had been replaced by more modest attire that suggested someone who was rebuilding his identity from the ground up rather than simply managing a temporary crisis. "Dr. Chen," he said as they were introduced backstage, extending his hand with obvious uncertainty about whether she would accept the gesture. "Thank you for agreeing to do this. I know it can't be easy." She shook his hand, studying his face for signs of manipulation or strategic positioning. But what she saw instead was genuine nervousness and what appeared to be authentic regret, emotions that seemed inconsistent with someone who was simply managing his public image for competitive advantage.
"Mr. Blackwell," she replied, "I'm hoping we can have a conversation today that helps other people avoid the mistakes we've all made in this situation." The panel discussion that followed would be remembered as one of the most honest and impactful presentations in the Business Council's history. Sarah spoke about the challenges of conducting competitive research without losing sight of ethical boundaries, acknowledging that their intelligence-gathering operation had pushed the limits of acceptable business practices, even if it hadn't crossed any legal lines. Marcus discussed his journey from public humiliation to genuine self-reflection, describing the process of recognizing that his successful career had been built on attitudes and behaviors that were fundamentally incompatible with the kind of leader he wanted to be. He spoke about the community organizations he now worked with, the people who had taught him about resilience and dignity, and the ways that losing his corporate identity had forced him to discover more meaningful definitions of success and achievement. But it was the final exchange between them that captured the audience's attention and generated the most discussion in the weeks that followed. The moderator asked whether they could envision working together professionally, given their shared commitment to ethical leadership and corporate responsibility. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, each recognizing that their answer would define not just their own relationship, but the broader message they were sending about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of transformation in business and personal relationships. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that the most important thing we can do is continue working separately toward the same goals." Mr. Blackwell has found meaningful work helping emerging entrepreneurs and advocating for respectful workplace cultures. Pinnacle Dynamics will continue building the kind of company we believe represents the future of ethical business practices. Sometimes the most collaborative thing you can do is pursue parallel paths rather than trying to force a partnership that might compromise everyone involved. Marcus nodded in agreement. "Dr. Chen is right. The best thing I can do is continue learning from the communities I'm now privileged to work with, and continue trying to earn the respect I thought I deserved but hadn't actually earned through my actions. Redemption isn't about returning to where you were before. It's about becoming someone worthy of a second chance." As the event concluded and the audience filed out, discussing what they had witnessed in hushed, thoughtful tones, Sarah realized that their conflict had generated something neither side had anticipated: a genuine conversation about character, accountability, and the possibility of meaningful change in corporate culture. The victory she had achieved was more complex and more valuable than the strategic defeat of a business rival. Through their elaborate operation and its unexpected consequences, they had created a case study in how public accountability could drive authentic personal growth and systemic cultural change. Marcus Blackwell's transformation from cautionary tale to advocate was proof that even successful people could learn difficult lessons about power, respect, and human dignity.
But perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated that ethical business practices weren't just moral imperatives, they were practical strategies for building sustainable competitive advantages in an economy where character and reputation mattered more than ever before. 3 years later, the autumn rain drummed against the windows of the newly constructed Community Center for Economic Justice, where Marcus Blackwell stood before a graduating class of 47 individuals who had completed the center's 6-month entrepreneurship program. The building itself was a testament to the unexpected directions that redemption could take. Funded through a partnership between Pinnacle Dynamics Community Outreach Initiative and a foundation that Marcus had established using the proceeds from his severance package and speaking engagements.
When I first walked into this center 3 years ago, Marcus told the graduates, his voice carrying the earned authority of someone whose wisdom had been purchased through public failure and private reconstruction, I thought I was here to teach you something about business. What I discovered was that you had much more to teach me about resilience, dignity, and what success actually means when it's measured in human terms rather than just financial metrics. Among the graduates was Maria Santos, who had launched a successful catering business that now employed 12 people and was expanding into corporate event planning. Her success story had become emblematic of the center's mission, providing not just business training, but the kind of mentorship and community support that enabled people to transform economic opportunity into sustainable prosperity. Mr. Blackwell, Maria said during the reception following the graduation ceremony, I want you to know that your story gave me courage to keep going when my business was struggling. Not because of what you achieved before, but because of how you handled losing everything and then rebuilt your life around better values. The comment reflected a shift that had occurred in Marcus's public reputation over the past 3 years. He was no longer known primarily as the executive who had been brought down by his own cruelty, but as someone who had transformed personal failure into a platform for helping others succeed. His speaking engagements now focused on authentic leadership, the importance of character in business relationships, and the ways that professional success could coexist with genuine respect for human dignity. Across the room, David Chen was having his own conversation with one of the program graduates, a former Titan Industries employee who had been laid off during the company's restructuring following Marcus's departure. The irony wasn't lost on him. Pinnacle Dynamics' competitive strategy had inadvertently created casualties among innocent employees who had never participated or endorsed their former executives' toxic behavior. Sometimes winning creates responsibilities you didn't anticipate, Sarah said quietly, joining her husband as the reception wound down. 3 years of reflection had taught her that their sophisticated campaign, while ethically justifiable, had generated consequences that extended far beyond their intended target. Marcus approached them as they prepared to leave, his expression thoughtful. I wanted to thank you both for what you've built here, he said, gesturing toward the center buzzing with conversations between graduates, mentors, and community supporters. This partnership shouldn't work, but it does. Maybe because we all learned something about the difference between winning and succeeding. Sarah studied his face, searching for traces of the man who had tried to humiliate her 3 years earlier. What she found instead was someone who had discovered that losing everything could be the first step toward finding something worth keeping. The real victory, she replied, was never about destroying each other's companies. It was about proving that business can be conducted with integrity and respect for human dignity. As they walked toward the parking garage together, former enemies who had become unlikely collaborators in demonstrating that accountability could lead to authentic change, Marcus realized that his legacy would not be defined by the deals he had closed or the profits he had generated during his corporate career. Instead, it would be measured by the businesses launched, the community strengthened, and the lives improved through the center that had emerged from the ashes of his public downfall. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that looked like defeats, until you understood what you were really fighting for.